Michael Kirby, thank you so much for making the time to have a little chat to us today about your insights into the impact of technology on society.
Yes, I apologise that I can't be at the conference, but I'm doing a long-arranged appointment, and they would have skinned me if I'd not turned up.
Notwithstanding that, and I know you have been both a keynote speaker and a guest at the previous gala dinners that we ran as the Internet Industry Association, as we then were. And
it was a very male-dominated industry. I hope things have improved a little bit. I'm looking around in the industry to see whether the gender balance has changed a bit. It was even worse than the legal profession in my early days.
Well, you actually made the point on the night when you addressed us in 2008, and in the 4 parables of Internet regulation that you had kindly written for us, and is still available on YouTube and on the High Court website as the transcript.
I hope the High Court justices are looking at it.
The legal profession is not that far behind the technology profession, but I have to say that there are very positive moves within the technology sector to encourage more women to take on the roles within cybersecurity in particular.
It probably has to start earlier than the industry. It has to start in schooling,
right,
and in recognition that women and men can be equal if they're given the equal opportunity in mathematics, science, and other relevant training.
Right. And I think, we could sort of foray into the neurological differences between men and women, but there is something that women definitely bring to a problem, to a situation.
They sure do. They will talk about it. They will talk with each other. They will network about it. They were the original networkers long before the mobile phone came along, because they often carry the burdens of the world in families and breakdown and problems, and they will talk about it. Men won't talk about it. My father would not talk about his prostate cancer, and that ultimately killed him at 95. But people, old men, don't only die with it, they die of it. It's a very painful death. So everyone should check, who is a male, and that'll be most of them, should check their prostate.
Well, that's a salutary place to start, but I wanted to move sideways, as it were, into the event itself, that we're celebrating 30 years of the internet in Australia this year. And it's an amazing thing to live through a revolution as we have.
It is. And it's astonishing. And it just goes to show the thing we've got to ask ourselves is, what are the other revolutions that are just around the corner that we haven't foreseen that are going to hit us during our remaining lifetimes?
And in fact, there is quite an active discussion at the moment around artificial intelligence and machine intelligence overtaking human intelligence.
Yes, a number of deans, including the new dean, executive dean at Queensland University of Technology, Dan Hunter, who was Dean of Law at Swinburne University. He says it is now bordering on professional negligence for a law dean not to be engaged with the issue of artificial intelligence and not to be talking with his students and informing them and making sure they are aware of the likely big impact of artificial intelligence on the law and on the delivery of legal services and on the future of the legal firm.
And I guess generalizing that observation to the effect on society, we can't even begin to imagine the disruption that AI will cause. There's undoubtedly going to be very positive outcomes from AI.
Well, I will see it tomorrow when I go to a trip to the United States. I will go through the immigration counter leaving Australia. No more agents scrutinising me, looking at my photo and looking at me. The whole process for 99% of people going away from Australia is performed by scanning and artificial intelligence.
And you just hope that the algorithm has you in there correctly. Do you remember the film? There was a film called Brazil that was produced by the guys that did Monty Python. And it was a dystopian future where a simple error, a computing error, had misidentified an innocent person as being an enemy of the state. And it's a black comedy, but it really does highlight, the conflict that we face in society, where decisions affecting our own liberties and rights as humans.
That is true, but I don't think we should be pessimistic on the whole about artificial intelligence. On the whole, I think it's going, like the internet, to be a tremendous advantage to humankind, and we've got to use our human intelligence and our human sensibility to make sure that we end up in control of it, and that it is our servant and doesn't become our master.
Right.
It's not coincidental that in my work on human rights in North Korea, one of the early surprises I got was that Kim Jong-un has banned the access to the internet for the people of North Korea. The only people who have access to the internet are the elite, the people who are the reliable classes that work for the dictatorship in North Korea. So you have to sort of think what Stalin or other tyrants would have made of the internet, but also the great advantages in a free society of giving people everywhere access to information. For example, when I was a young lawyer, it was very difficult to get up-to-date legal material about cases or even statutes which were part of the law of the land. Now, thanks substantially to a great initiative of legal academics at the University of New South Wales and University of Technology, Sydney, Graham Greenleaf, Professor Mowbray and Professor Chung, people everywhere in Australia, not just lawyers, but citizens, can get access to the latest cases, the latest statutes, and this has spread right around the common law world. India uses the technology which was developed in Australia. The biggest common law country and parliamentary democracy in the world uses our technological advancement. It's a great step forward for liberty of access to the law.
That's interesting you should say that. As you're saying it, I'm remembering back at my days at law school at the University of Tasmania, which, though the fourth or third oldest law school in Australia, had a very under-resourced law library. But what they did have, through the ingenuity and initiative of one of the computer guys there, was a Mac lab, a room full of computers that were well connected to the internet. And I remember a lot of my legal studies were actually utilizing resources that we could get online.
It's still a very fine law school, and it still has people who are real experts, and probably that Mac lab contributed to the ideas of the internet and the law. In fact, the University of Tasmania has the only law review, which is the Journal of Law and Information Science, and I happen to be the chair of the advisory board.
Well, that's funny.
I'll
because
get you a subscription.
I was on the editorial board of that magazine when I was studying.
Well, you left it in a perfect state, so we are now working in your shadow.
Yeah, I did write an article. I think it was about internet regulation, actually, in '96. That would have been so. And actually, I remember building a website for the university that was the Australian Intellectual Property Law Locus, we called it. And my lecturers had permitted me to develop a website instead of writing an assignment, which I thought was very brave of them. And we went on to create a legal resource that was relying on Graham Greenleaf's work at Austlii. And we had actually referenced a lot of the cases through his work.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in the last week or so, there have been articles in the newspapers protesting at the imposition on legal academics advancing in the law of having to have a PhD, which was the old rule for getting evenness in promotions and advancement and legal research. But nowadays, people may have other ways of developing their minds and developing their knowledge, and including knowledge of a wider world than Tasmania, Australia.
Right.
You've gone on to look to a wider world, and so have I. From my law school days in Sydney, it's so different today, and it's at the fingertips of every person. They're all there on the Bondi Junction train at 4:55 in the morning. When I get the first train to work, They're all there looking at their mobile phone, and into the internet they plunge.
Into another reality which is somewhat disconnected, and I think this is one of the challenges that I wanted to briefly raise with you is how as society do you feel that we're adapting to technology where you have this compulsive urge to remain apprised of what's happening on the internet, but at the same time you're still functioning within a physical environment. Do you think there's a tension there? Or?
Oh, well, obviously there's a tension, and that tension hasn't yet been fully resolved. It's a bit like those early days when, in the Australian Law Reform Commission, when I was the chair and working with the Australian Computer Society, we began the steps that led to the Privacy Act. And we began those steps by reference to the OECD guidelines on privacy, 78 to 80, which remarkably enough are still accepted by the international community as the basic requirements of fair dealing in respect of privacy. But one of our principles was that information that is collected, personal information relating to an individual data subject, collected for a particular purpose, can never thereafter be used for another purpose without the authority of law or the consent of the data subject. And that was a good principle in 1978-80.
Right.
But come along with Google and search engines, and now we insist on being able to use earlier data for personal and non-personal use. And this therefore shows that it's often very hard to regulate because the technology changes, and therefore the basis on which the regulation is framed, good for its time, is overtaken by the advancements in the technology. And that is even more so today.
That is so, and I remember when Lawrence Lessig came out to Australia, and we've talked about this before,
Yes.
and he'd written that book, Code as Law.
Yes.
And it was a very advanced...
I referred to that book in a case in the High Court.
I think
that might have been the first reference to Lawrence's work. And he was an amazing and very forward-looking guru.
He was, and I was very captivated by this idea that was, I think, very novel for its time, that the technology embodies value judgments and moral and ethical, I suppose, positions in respect of individuals.
That's right. Now, I think there's a very good illustration of that. That is the Mabo case. In the Mabo case, the challenge brought by Mr. Mabo was to 150 years of settled land law in Australia. And I could have gone away into a corner and written the reasons why you should not recognise Aboriginal title, or at least the judges shouldn't do it. It should be done by Parliament. But the High Court of Australia, looking to international principles of human rights, especially the principle that you cannot deprive people of fundamental rights by reference to their race, which is what we did in Australia for the first 170 years of our existence. And they said that can no longer be the law. So it required a lurch, a change, made by human beings, made by reference to grand principles of universal human rights, and how you could program that into a system, and how you could make sure that there is always that leeway for change to adjust to fundamental principles of justice and human rights. That really is the challenge that the new technology presents to us. Otherwise, we will clone-like just keep reproducing old laws, even though society's values and culture have changed.
And I remember, as we were taught in law school, that the power of the common law is its capacity to adapt to changes in society.
Yes, I'm not sure all my colleagues agreed with that. But,
you were considered the great dissenter and a judicial activist by some, but I mean, that's the nature of our system, isn't it? That we and of course there are parliaments as well to amend laws.
Well, and most law in Australia and most democratic countries are made by Parliament, but We do need that leeway for choice and change, which Professor Stone taught me at law school, and I never forgot his lessons. When Chief Justice Mason, after Mabo, he sat in Mabo, I didn't, it was decided before my time on the High Court, when he was asked where do these rights to adapt the law come from, and he just looked at the law books behind him and he said, where do you think the common law came from? It came from multiple decisions, millions of decisions in particular cases, adapting and reproducing in an adaptive way to the justice of new circumstances.
And I guess that's the point, and I guess it's inherent or implicit in what Lessig was saying, that unlike the law that we know through the historical precedents that it creates, really to reiterate the point, really, that what you do when you codify law or values into technology is you freeze them in time. And so you've lost the capability to adapt. And I suppose that's essentially the warning, isn't it? That as we devolve more of our humanity, as it were, into technology.
It is, it's the warning, but whilst we're getting somber and thinking about the warnings, we've got to think of the opportunities. And if you ask what is the big problem in the law in Australia, I would say the big problem is that it is a very expensive profession because its personnel have all been very thoroughly and lengthily trained. And therefore, it costs so much money that many people can't get to law and can't get to justice. There's been an estimate that about 80% at least of legal problems never get off the launch pad because people just can't afford it, including judges and other relatively wealthy people. So the hope is that with artificial intelligence, this is something Professor Dan Hunter teaches, with it will come ways of delivering many solutions to people of modest means. And if that gives them access to the law and to elementary justice, then that is a good thing, an undoubted good thing, because at the moment they're just left twiddling their thumbs and denouncing the law and lawyers, whereas in the future there will be ways of bringing community justice, first of all citizens to the law books, as can happen now, but there will be ways of simple mediation and decision making, at least at the first level of decision making. There may need to be access, and there may need to be access in order to be sure that in the end you can get to that human sense of justice that is a special feature of our legal system when you ultimately get to the High Court, uncorrupted judges with powers to adapt and change. But how many people can get there?
It's not accessible, is it? And I remember a Law Reform Commission report, I think it was called Access Denied or something of that nature, and they were talking about the delays, that justice delayed is justice denied.
Yes, well, it's not only delayed, justice denied was what was stated in Magna Carta in 1215. But the problem now is that you have a system which, if you can work it, is a very just system. You will get ultimately, overwhelmingly, to just and reasoned and explained outcomes. But if you can't get into the door, if it's just too expensive. In the old days, the work of lawyers was often cross-subsidised by land title conveyancing. But then when anti-monopoly law came in, that really was removed from the cross-subsidising capacity. And so getting people to pro bono legal assistance is only a very temporary holding pattern. We need something better.
There's a more fundamental problem you're suggesting.
It is, and hopefully AI is going to help to solve it. But then we've got to find other things that lawyers don't do now that they can do that will be socially useful and worthy of the expense. And to the extent that we can't, we've got to keep the lawyers and other people occupied. And this is going to be the challenge in the future. Government finding ways to deal with people who used to do routine jobs, but in a world in which the routine jobs are simply disappearing.
Taken over by machines and automation. And I think you were almost heading in that direction with your previous comments. I was thinking a judicial algorithm, sort of where we were slightly moving on this point of automating at least the preliminary stages of justice. Is that what you were sort of moving towards?
Yes, but we were at that stage, even in my time as a judge in the Court of Appeal, we had a case where a man sued for damage to his penis. And the judge, it didn't affect his reproductive capacity, but it affected the appearance and so on. And he sued for damages. And one of my colleagues said, well, fortunately, he was not a woman, and therefore appearances didn't really matter. And this was a very male attitude.
Right.
Many men, straight or gay, would think it's very important matter, but it was a way in which the internal algorithm was programmed to cultural norms and stereotypical prejudices, and so human beings are not necessarily the best judges of justice, but machines don't have a will to do justice.
Right.
So somewhere between those two points of the spectrum is where we stand, and what we have to do is make sure that any algorithms for delivery of law can adapt to the justice of the particular case ultimately.
That's a fascinating analysis, and I think an invitation, I suppose, for our legal and technology innovators to try and explore these issues in more depth around this, what is our ultimate objective. And I think the point you make about access to the judicial system for people irrespective of means is very pertinent. And in fact, you remind me of a observation that I used to make around the ultimate effect of technology is to bring to the masses privileges and facilities that were previously only in the preserve of the very wealthy.
Well, look what happens now. I mean, people can get access on YouTube to the greatest singers in the world, and they can have people reading and playing the greatest Shakespeare dramas. They can find documentaries on everything. They can get through Wikipedia and other sources huge amounts of information that was not known. They've become a supplement to the human brain, and the puzzling question is whether we are headed for some sort of implant that makes having a little machine with all this capacity look very old-fashioned, because you can simply roll your eyes or shake your head and there it will be in your head. And it is a supplement to the brain and to our existence.
That's right. This is the concept of the singularity, the merging of man and machine, as it were, that we become superhuman, effectively. And an observation that I've made before, and I think others agree, is that the effect of technology, whether it be a pair of pliers or a microscope or an amplifier, hearing aid or anything, is to really elevate human capability.
Yes, but the real question is not elevating, but moving far beyond, and then in effect changing the essential character of the human being who is supplemented by these capacities. And I ask forgiveness for constantly talking about the law, because that was my vocation. I know it, and I've thought of all the issues. But every occupation, every job, every human existence is profoundly affected by the changes that are happening. And that's why it's a great thing that the profession comes together, not just to think about ways that the technology can be made to work better, but to think about where the technology is taking us, the human species, into the future, into a dangerous world of nuclear weapons, a dangerous world of climate change, dangerous world of big migrations of people, shortage of water, all of these problems. But amongst all of these is this amazing technology which can be a great boon to humankind so long as we remain in charge of it.
I think that's a very great place to end. But I want to thank you, Michael Kirby, for your own thinking in this area and the advocacy that you continue to perform on behalf, I suppose, of Australia as you travel overseas, and your vast experience as I think Australia's longest serving judicial officer. Certainly that was the point where you were at in 2008.
Well, thank you, Peter, and we will continue this conversation in about 20 or 25 years' time.
And can I thank you, Michael, also just for the personal guidance that you've given me, in my previous role, being an independent voice, as it were, a reality check, and a constant reminder of the need to remember the human. This has been such an important lesson and a value to carry forward. So thank you so much.
It's been a privilege to know you.
Thank you so much.